Today we're taking a look at an incredible game played by the great Bobby Fischer when he was only 16 years old. It's one of the most historically significant that he's ever played, as it's the first time that he ever beat a Soviet grandmaster, which at the time was a huge deal, both for Fischer and the Russians, who viewed their domination in chess as a sign of their supposed intellectual superiority. At least that's what's been said, and I don't doubt it. They certainly enjoyed flexing their military capabilities during this time period. And fun fact, for those who didn't already know, Bobby Fischer's real father is now believed to be this guy, Paul Keres, a Hungarian physicist who actually helped design the triggering mechanism for the first atomic bomb during World War II. So you got the father helping design our main military weapon in the Cold War, and then you got his son challenging the Soviets intellectually. And they took notice, because Bobby Fischer didn't just take down any old grandmaster, he defeated a true powerhouse of the game, the eternal world's number 2 as he's been called, Paul Keres of Estonia, who at the time of this game was getting a little past his prime, though still ranked number 5 in the world according to chess metrics. So this game was a real wake-up call for the Russians, who according to Fischer had always underestimated him and talked a lot of smack, but after this game they really had no choice but to start taking him a whole lot more seriously. After all, if he could do such a thing to their number 5 player at age 16, what would he be able to do in another 10 or 15 years? Well, we all know how that turned out, but let's get into this game. It's a real masterpiece. Fischer plays a shocking and brilliant move that you're just gonna love. He's got the white pieces in this one, and he opens the game with his all-time favorite move, e4. Keres responds e5, and for about the next 12 moves of the game, we have an absolute mainest of mainline Ruy Lopez, which by definition begins with the moves knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. So we're going to breeze through this opening pretty quickly. These moves have literally been seen millions of times, and just to give you an idea, in the database that I use, about 1 out of every 1,500 games tracks this game exactly for the first 12 moves, which go as follows. a6, questioning the bishop. Bishop takes knight followed by knight takes e5 will not win a pawn, of course, due to queen to d4, attacking both pawn and knight, hence the move bishop to a4. We have knight to f6, castles. Knight takes e4 is playable now for black, but that doesn't win a pawn, since white can easily get the pawn right back, starting with rook to e1, although d4 is considered to be even stronger. Play continues bishop to e7, rook to e1, b5, kicking the bishop back to b3, d6, adding defense to e5, relieving the knight on c6 of that duty, and so threatening knight to a5, followed by knight takes b3, achieving a favorable bishop for knight trade. Hence the multi-purpose response, c3, giving the bishop an escape square, while also supporting the move d4. Keres castles, Fischer plays h3, preventing any bishop to g4 to undermine his knight's defense of the d4 square, where he is planning on pushing a pawn very soon. We have knight to a5, putting the knight on the rim, where it can often be grim, though this wasn't done on a whim. And I just had a thought, wouldn't it be cool if Dr. Seuss had written books about chess? Now that would be interesting. Anyway, this knight maneuver is fully justified as it comes with an attack on the bishop while clearing the way for the move c5 to take more control of d4 with a pawn. We have bishop to c2, c5, Fischer plays his d4, attacking e5 twice. Keres responds queen to c7, adding defense, while also placing his queen on the soon-to-be-opened c-file. Fischer develops his knight to d2, we have c takes d4, and now bishop to b7. A move that's not nearly as popular as it used to be. Nowadays, most strong players prefer knight to c6 or bishop to d7, but back when this game was played, bishop to b7 was still considered to be a top-tier move. Black is increasing the pressure on e4, but after d5, which was not played by Fischer, the engine evaluates this position as being almost a pawn in white's favor. Probably because computers just seem to love gaining space, but there's also the fact that this bishop's diagonal has been completely shut down for the moment, his knight can't go back to c6, and there's more to it than that, but suffice to say that because of this move d5, bishop to b7 no longer enjoys the reputation that it once had. Back in 1959, however, the virtues of d5 were not yet fully appreciated, and so knight to f1, now played by Fischer, was still slightly more popular, planning to redeploy the knight to g3 and then eye up that juicy undefended f5 square. Keres places his rook on the open file, threatening to win the bishop on c2. Fischer puts it on d3. Keres now moves his knight back towards the center of the board. It's done its duty on a5. And for 4 of the next 5 moves, the engine continues to say that white can get a big advantage with that move d5. But young Fischer continues to rely on the opening theory of the day, which says white should either play knight to g3 or the move Fischer plays, knight to e3, looking to hop into f5 next. Keres responds rook f to e8, clearing the f8 square so that after knight to f5, he can play bishop to f8, preserving his bishop pair while also opening his rook's eyes towards the center of the board, and so threatening to capture on d4 a couple of times, exposing a triple attack on the e4 pawn. But he should have captured on d4 right away, preventing white from playing d5, although in this position, Fischer's move bishop to g5 is much stronger, threatening to severely compromise black's kingside pawn structure with bishop takes f6. So how to cope with this as black? You don't really want to put the bishop right back to e7, that's an admission of failure. You also don't want to go into a self-pin with the abysmal queen to d8, so Keres plays knight to d7, which is the best move. Once again, white should play d5, and once again, Fischer does not play it. He instead goes for rook to c1, which looks quite natural, pinning the knight on c6 to the queen, and so threatening to win it with d5 next. Keres responds queen to b8, breaking the pin, at which point both players are apparently considering a capture on d4 as being quite imminent, as evidenced by Fischer's decision to now play bishop to b1, opening his queen's eyes to that square, as well as the decision by Keres to now play it with knight takes d4. Fischer responds knight 3 takes d4, at which point we have a significant inaccuracy. What Keres needs to play is the obvious e takes d4, when after queen takes d4, white will have a significant advantage, but not nearly as significant as it is after the move played in the game, rook takes c1, which superficially looks quite logical. If white recaptures with the queen, then after e takes d4, there's no queen takes d4, he's only got knight takes d4, removing the knight from its beautiful f5 post. But Fischer has a much better way to capture the rook, and that is with bishop takes c1. Now after e takes d4, Keres was most likely anticipating the obvious queen takes d4. Then he could play d5 to trade off his weak d-pawn, which white cannot win with e takes d5, as this would allow checkmate in 1 with rook takes e1 check. And this was the main point to black's move rook takes c1, since if white still had a rook on that square, then he could simply recapture on e1 and be up a pawn, as opposed to being checkmated as he is here. But none of this happened in the game, because in this position, after pawn takes d4, Fischer does not recapture with the queen, neither does he recapture with the knight, but instead uncorks a powerful and shocking move, which I of course invite you to try to spot. Go ahead and pause the video if you've never seen this game and would like to try to be just like Bobby Fischer. The nuclear tactic, now detonated by the young Bobby Fischer, is knight to h6 check, which is fairly simple once you see it, the point being that if pawn takes knight, then white has queen to g4 check, picking up the loose knight on d7, but spotting this kind of thing over the board, especially when you don't already know there's a tactic available, is not so easy. But even at his young age, there isn't a whole lot that gets by Bobby Fischer. Now Keres does capture the knight, but just to cover our bases, let's quickly take a look at king to h8. This allows the knight to capture on f7 with check, and after king to g8, the knight can just go right back to h6 with check. If king back to h8, then white has queen takes d4, pinning the g7 pawn of the king, thus preventing black from taking his knight on h6. White's now a pawn up with a much superior and totally winning position. This is why, in the game, Keres makes the wise decision to just take the knight on h6, since after queen to g4 check, king to h8, and queen takes knight on d7, at least he's the one with the extra pawn, but it's not a healthy pawn. In fact, black's entire pawn structure from the d file on over is about as disease-ridden as it could possibly be. None of these pawns can ever defend one another. What's more, the white queen has infiltrated black's camp, threatening to take another pawn on f7, which is why Keres now plays bishop to d5, adding some defense, while taking advantage of the pin on white's e-pawn to his undefended rook on e1. Fischer plays queen to f5, attacking that bishop, which Keres now defends in the most active way possible, rook to e5, attacking the queen, which the engine now recommends moving to f4. Then white can play b4, bishop to b2, and go after black's pawn on d4. But Fischer has a different plan. He plays queen to f3, putting himself in a double pin, which Keres wastes no time in exploiting with the move f5, increasing pressure on the e4 pawn, which is now pinned to both queen and rook. Fischer has foreseen all of this though, and he knows he's still in the driver's seat after bishop to f4, attacking the rook. It drops back to e8, and now we have queen to h5, attacking f5 with the queen, as well as h6 with 2 pieces. Looks very nice, but it's not the strongest move. Much better, and possibly the only winning move, was queen to d1, threatening both queen takes pawn on d4 and pawn takes bishop, as this also adds defense to the rook on e1, thereby unpinning the e-pawn. But after queen to h5, Keres is now able to win the pawn on e4. Now he'd love to be able to do it with f takes e4, improving his pawn structure. Unfortunately, this would drop the bishop on d5, so we have bishop takes e4, f3 from Bobby, forcing the bishop to c6, where it adds some absolutely essential defense to the rook on e8, which is now attacked twice. And here's a trick question for you. What should white play in this position? Were you tempted to play rook takes e8, when after bishop takes e8, it looks like black is in big trouble after queen takes f5, threatening checkmate in 2 different ways? And if not, was it because you saw that after bishop to g6, black is the one who is winning, threatening to pick up the bishop on b1, while also noting that queen to f6 check doesn't help after bishop to g7? When the queen's hit, the bishop's hit, and white is severely hosed? If so, congratulations. What's played in the game is a move much superior to rook takes on e8, rook to c1, attacking the bishop. Keres moves it to d7, defending f5, Fischer grabs the pawn on h6, at which point black's best move is not an easy one to spot. If you'd like to give it a shot, go right ahead, and then give yourself a brutal pat on the back if you can find it, because it went totally unnoticed for many years, and even the great Garry Kasparov failed to mention it in his analysis of this game. But it has been confirmed by the almighty, all-knowing Stockfish that black's only hope of survival is with the move queen to d8, which does a couple of things. It prevents white from playing bishop takes f8, followed by queen to h4, targeting the d4 pawn, and it prepares to meet bishop to f4, targeting the pawn on f5, with queen to f6 defending. And I'm sure it does more than that, but what Keres tries is rook to e6, a total blunder, which loses by force, despite the fact that both Kasparov and Fischer himself praised this move and gave it the exclam. I guess the thinking here is that if white were to move his now twice attacked bishop to f4, threatening bishop takes f5, then black can play queen to e8, attacking white's queen, which may not capture on f5, lest it be lost to rook to e1 check, followed by bishop takes queen. But what everybody missed, for many years apparently, is the winning sequence found by Stockfish, beginning with queen to f7, attacking both of black's bishops. Now we don't have time to look at everything here, but I'll just quickly show you the engine's top line, which goes as follows. Bishop takes bishop on h6, queen takes bishop on d7, bishop takes rook, queen takes rook, queen to f8, guarding the f6 square, bishop takes f5, bishop takes b2, queen to d7, threatening checkmate on h7, queen to g8 defending, after which black's queen is tied down to defending h7. He does have this scary looking passed pawn on d4, but white's bishop has d3 under control, and black just doesn't have anything to do here, while white is threatening to win the game by pushing his kingside pawn majority. Let's return to the game though, where Fischer does not find the crushing queen to f7, but rather tries bishop takes f8. His idea is that after queen takes f8, queen to h4 attacking d4, and queen to f6 defending, he can now trade queens, and after rook takes f6, even though he's a pawn down, black's still got this horrendously weak pawn structure, and Fischer is all set to infiltrate and start causing some trouble with rook to c7. He first plays king to f2 though, a move that was later criticized as being too slow, but it doesn't really matter. Either way, the position's a dead draw. Keres replies king to g7, moving his king towards the center, as one typically does in the endgame. Now the rook comes into c7, attacking and pinning the bishop to the king. Rook to f7 is the only defense. We have king to e2, threatening to round up black's d-pawn with king to d3, followed by king takes d4. Keres defends by playing f4, threatening to meet king to d3 with bishop to f5 check, giving black his choice of either the rook on c7 or the bishop on b1. So Fischer plays rook to a7, going after the pawn on a6. We have king to f6, rook takes pawn, now threatening to win the pawn on d6. Keres responds rook to e7 check. If king to d3, then bishop to f5 check will win the bishop on b1, so the king goes back to f2. Now black has a few good moves to maintain the draw. He can play the obvious king to e6 or king to e5, defending d6, or the more proactive bishop to f5, forcing the trade of bishops. Now this does give up a pawn to bishop takes f5, king takes f5, and rook takes d6, but after king to e5, white is going to have to be very careful of black's passed pawn on d4 since he no longer has his bishop around to guard d3, which is why it's probably safest for white's rook to stay behind the pawn with rook to d8 as opposed to running rampant all over the board, as is the case in the game, where after the move Keres plays bishop to e6, a big mistake, Fischer now plays rook takes d6, when after king to e5, Keres is now losing. Though perhaps not obviously so, Fischer is going to have to play with the utmost precision if he is to take home the full point, and he does pretty well for a few moves. We have rook to c6, bishop to d5 attacking the rook, it slides over to h6, Keres takes control of the open file with rook to c7, Fischer delivers a series of checks with rook to h5 check, king to d6, rook to h6 check, king to e5, rook back to h5 with check, king back to d6. It's not so obvious how white's making progress here, but he does have a killer move in this position, and it's a challenging one to spot. Fischer couldn't find it, but pause the video if you'd like to take a crack at it. White's best move, and possibly the only winning one, is b3. Why? Because after rook to c1 attacking the bishop and bishop to e4, because of this move b3, black cannot play bishop to c4 to support the further advance of his d-pawn while also threatening rook to f1 checkmate, since here white will of course just take his bishop on c4. The move Fischer tries, after king to d6, is rook to f5, going after the pawn on f4. Looks sensible, that pawn cannot really be saved, but this most likely throws away the win to rook to c1, hitting the bishop. It goes to d3, we have rook to d1, attacking it again, king to e2 defends, the rook goes to g1, attacking g2, king to f2 defends. We have a little back and forth now with rook to d1, king to e2, rook to g1, and now rook to g5. At which point we get to see another reason that b3 would have been a good move, and that is that it would have prevented Keres from now playing bishop takes a2. Now Fischer does get to grab the pawn on b5, but here comes rook to b1 targeting b2. We have king to d3, counterattacking d4, h6 hitting the rook, rook to h5, and now comes a big trade of pawns with rook takes b2, king takes d4, rook takes g2, rook takes h6 with check, and king to e7. Fischer has emerged with the extra pawn, but in this simplified position, Keres now has pretty decent chances of survival. Fischer continues king to e4, attacking f4, we have rook to g5, counterattacking the bishop on b5, bishop to a6, bishop to f7, adding some defense to the square in front of Fischer's passer. Very sensible. Fischer could now capture the pawn on f4, but he knows that it's not going anywhere, so he decides to first improve his bishop's position with bishop to c8. Maybe he'll go to g4, adding some defense to h5, then he can push his pawn there. Keres plays rook to g6, offering a trade of rooks, which many a weak player would surely accept with rook takes g6, bishop takes g6 check, and king takes f4, thinking they had a winning position on account of their two pawns versus black's 0. But this position is a theoretical draw, and the reason is that white's bishop cannot defend the promotion square of the h-pawn. This means that black can just sacrifice his bishop for white's f-pawn if necessary, then he can move his king towards the h-file where it will alternate between the g8 and h8 squares, leaving white with no way to promote his remaining pawn due to the threat of stalemate. So a very important theoretical draw to be aware of. Fischer of course is not going to fall for that, which is why, after rook to g6, he does not go for the rook trade, but instead plays rook to h7. Next is king to f8, bishop to g4, and now comes a big blunder, which if you're not a computer, or Magnus Carlsen, is not so easy to identify as such. Apparently what black needs to play is something like rook to a6. Then after king takes f4, he can start harassing the white king with some lateral checks, and black's still got a tough road ahead of him, but the engine isn't giving a convincing evaluation in white's favor, and so that's good enough for me. What Keres decides to try is rook to g7. Again offering a trade of rooks, which once again white should not accept if he wants to avoid the draw. But this puts black's rook on a passive square, which seems to be enough to decisively tip the balance in white's favor after Fischer's strong reply, rook to h6. Now the best try for black at this point is probably rook to g5, when he'll still be totally losing, but proving it is not so easy, and well beyond the scope of this video. So we're just going to press on with the move played in the game, rook to g6, once again offering the trade of rooks, but this time Bobby Fischer accepts with rook takes g6, having accurately foreseen that after bishop takes g6 check and king takes f4, unlike that previous rook trade we look at, here black does not have the draw, and the reason is that after king to g7, Fischer is able to get his king to g5 before black has a chance to prevent it with king to f6. This wasn't the case in the previous line we looked at, and this turns out to be an ideal square for the white king, supporting the advance of both of his passed pawns. Now you might be asking, can't black still sack his bishop for white's f-pawn, achieving that theoretical draw? Well, Fischer has accurately concluded that he will be able to prevent that from happening, and we're about to see how he masterfully goes about doing just that. Keres now plays bishop to d3, and after f4 and bishop to e4, Fischer's f-pawn is now stuck for the moment. If he plays f5, then there's of course bishop takes pawn, and it's a draw. So he starts pushing his h-pawn. Keres says, that's cool, I got plenty of bishop moves. He plays bishop to d3, we have h5, bishop to e4, h6 check, king to h8, and now bishop to f5, forcing Keres to now abandon this diagonal. So he puts his bishop on d5, Fischer continues bishop to g6, preparing a possible f5, but now Keres plays bishop to e6, once again halting the f-pawn's progress. But not the king's progress, because here comes king to f6, attacking the bishop. It goes to c4, ready to meet f5 with bishop to d3 when bishop takes f5 and the ensuing draw will be unavoidable, so Fischer puts his king back on g5, threatening f5 followed by an immediate f6. Keres puts his bishop back on e6, repeating the position, surely praying for a draw by repetition, but now Fischer finds the correct path forward with bishop to h5. We have king to h7 and now bishop to g4, driving black's bishop from this diagonal. And so after bishop to c4, Fischer is now able to push his pawn to f5 without it being captured. Keres puts his bishop on f7, we have bishop to h5 challenging its position, bishop to c4, and now bishop to g6 check, forcing the black king to move backwards. It goes to g8, and after Fischer's next move, f6, the great Paul Keres resigns the game. The problem is this, black's king is confined to either g8 or h8, because if it ever moves to f8, then white will play h7, and there's no way to stop the h-pawn from promoting. So he's really got nothing better here than just moving his bishop around. So let's see how that plays out. Here's how it all goes down. Bishop to b3, king to f4, bishop to c4, king to e5, bishop to b3, king to d6, bishop to c4, bishop to f5, and I think you probably know what's about to happen. White's threatening bishop to e6 check, which would force the trade of bishops, and black simply has no way to both avoid the bishop trade and prevent white's f-pawn from pushing on through. He can try bishop to f7, but after bishop to e6, what are you doing? There's simply no defense against bishop takes f7 followed by the promotion of the h-pawn. So there you have it, a major milestone in the career of the 16-year-old Bobby Fischer, defeating his first Soviet grandmaster. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy the content. Don't forget to smash that like button to show your support, and I will see you next time.